needs and agenda of the people who are there. So let's see where it goes. And I should probably tell you a little bit about myself as a sort of a disclaimer here. My worldview may not be your worldview. I come from a context of the 1960s, radical resistance. To give you a hint, when I was in graduate school, one of my field placements, one of my internships was with the United Farm Workers and the lettuce boycott, which some of you might remember from the 70s. I went to Pitt, which was at the time, a very radical, politically oriented school of social work. And I come from a background where that was a left-wing kind of mindset. I'm not asking you to agree with my mindset by any means. I also want to make one other disclaimer here before we dive into the topic. Part of resistance, one possible piece of resistance, is civil disobedience and knowingly breaking the law. I want to be real clear that I'm not advocating that any of you go out and promiscuously break the law. Please don't go break the law and say, well, Jacob said it was okay. I don't want to do that. But we'll talk about moral disengagement and civil disobedience, and we'll talk about how possibly resisting a law can be worthwhile. I'll show you some pictures of criminals too. So, anybody have any questions now before we move on? No comments? Okay, in a smaller group, I'd probably have 6 different comments. This technology is a little bit different, but don't hesitate if you have something to say. Let me move through the slideshow for a little bit here. If you look at our code of ethics, these are the core values of the profession: service, social justice, dignity and worth, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. It's that second one that's really an important piece. It's been with us from the earliest days of the profession that we seek and agitate for social justice. I don't think there's anything controversial here, but it's in our code of ethics. If you haven't recently read the code of ethics, it's actually a remarkable document, a very progressive document. Long, tedious, I would have written it differently, but the content is really, really fine. Here's what the Code of Ethics says about moral agency. You can read this. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just really quickly, it's our mandate to promote social justice and social change. Now look at this second one. This is really important. Ethical decision-making must apply to the informed judgment of the individual social worker. What I'm suggesting here is that your mindset about agitating for social justice is your decision. It's not a consultant's or a supervisor's decision. That's important. This next one, I've spent hours talking about this with people. Instances may arise when social workers' ethical obligations conflict with agency policies or relevant laws or regulations. When such conflicts occur, social workers must make a responsible effort to resolve the conflict before making a decision. That's as close as the Code of Ethics ever comes to saying practice civil disobedience or break the law. Got to remember, our country was founded on civil disobedience. The events leading up to the American Revolution were acts of civil disobedience. The Boston Tea Party, many other events were civil disobedience. And this last one I want to talk about, social workers should not allow an employee organization's policies, et cetera, to interfere with their ethical practice of social work. That's a scary thing, because what that's saying is, hey, the place where you work, the place that pays you your salary, lets you pay your rent or your mortgage, may still be a place where you need to, or you should, agitate for social change. I had a student who was working at a shelter for, an abuse shelter for women. And she looked over their policy manual, and she was horrified by some of the things she saw. And she went to her supervisor and her field placement supervisor and the field placement rep at school and said, "This is terrible. I want to change this." She got a lot of pushback, but eventually she was able to talk to some board members with the permission of her supervisor. And they gave her permission to propose some new guidelines, new policies and practices. And she did it. And she presented it to the board and to the executive staff. And they said, "You know, we were really annoyed at you at first, but you're right. And we're going to implement most of these." And she got some big changes. She got an A from me also, too. So that's what the code has to say about it. And hopefully, you know, our mindset about it is important. You know, when I was teaching, I taught at Marywood University School of Social Work for years in Pennsylvania. We moved to Vermont about 6 years ago, but before that I taught at Marywood. And for 1 year I taught at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And my favorite course to teach was American social welfare history. And almost every year in the first class or two, I would have a student raise his or her hand and say, "You know, I don't know why I have to learn this stuff. I'm going to be a therapist. I'm not interested in this." And I had a standard response. I would say to them, "Listen, if I do my job right this semester, and if you pay attention and do the work, I think by the end of the semester, you'll understand why understanding about American social welfare will instruct and inform your practice." Most of the time, students got that and did figure it out. After our current president was elected, NASW made a formal response. Basically, what they're saying is, "Hey, we're in a tough situation here. We have all kinds of problems. We want to support social workers as much as possible as we navigate the road ahead during these difficult times. We're counting on you to stand up for our collective goal to help our nation achieve greater social, economic, and environmental justice." So NASW was just redoubling its efforts to encourage people to stand up. Let's talk a little bit about the origins of our profession. I promise you I'm not going to do a whole classroom lecture about this, but I just want to put it in context. What I'm going to cover here in the next 3 or 4 minutes took up a good bit of a semester when I was teaching. You know, the Civil War is the central pivot of American history. Everything revolves around that. And after the war, these things happened: the industrialization, immigration, urbanization, emancipation, the Third Great Awakening, and a religious revival. A lot of the social activists of the late 19th century were motivated through the Third Great Awakening. They formed the various aspects of the progressive movement. There were all kinds of social reformers, charity organization societies, which were the settlement movement, were the origins of our profession. The charity organization societies began to set up schools. The School of Social Philanthropy, I think it was called. It still exists. It's called the Columbia University School of Social Work. But what people saw there and were horrified by were all of these terrible injustices. And there's one in particular that I want to talk about. There was a very famous newspaper reporter and photographer named Jacob Riis, published a book called How the Other Half Lives that just electrified the country. These are photographs he took in New York City of some of the poverty and misery that people experience, mostly immigrants and first-generation Americans. I just want to run through a few of these pictures because they had a powerful, powerful effect. This is where a guy slept. There's many more pictures. You know, when in a longer program, I would have shown you more pictures. And today, here are some of the national trends that have impacted on us: the Depression, World War II, et cetera, et cetera. The the welfare reform movement, which has just caused so many problems. And who knows what's going to be in store for us now, what has been in store with the Trump era. But here we had a profession that was born out of anger, born out of need to make some changes, do something dramatic. But then there was a big change, and we can pinpoint the year that it began, 1909. Something happened in 1909 that is really important. Can anybody identify these two characters? Type it in or unmute yourself.
Is that Sacco and Vanzetti?
Nope. Good guess, though. These two people influenced social work and all the mental health professions in the most massive way. Anybody want to take a shot? The guy on the left, that great big mustache, that's Sigmund Freud. The guy on the right with the buzz cut is Carl Jung. In 1909, they came to America for the first time. They did a series of lectures. The most famous of them were at Clark University in Massachusetts. And the impact on American culture was so massive that it's hard for us to even imagine it these days. Psychoanalytic thoughts, psychoanalytic ideas filtered into both the mental health professions and the common culture. I did research on this many years ago, and it was amazing to see how suddenly and pervasively mental health treatment became an important piece. Social work at the time was struggling with its identity. A very famous educator, Abraham Flexner, said, you know, you guys are not a profession. You borrow from the other professions, but you're not really a profession. And the leading social workers at the time were really upset about this, and they worked really hard to be able to redefine themselves as a profession. And one of the things they did was tap into psychoanalytic work, and that's where the real beginning of clinical social work came about. It wasn't just in social work, it was all the mental health professions. And their power, the influence is still here. We still have a lot of psychodynamically oriented treatment programs. But what happened there is that the clinical, to some degree, began to overshadow the social justice component. We really have these two polarities in our profession. We have the social justice component and the clinical component. My perspective is that they should not be separated. There's a social justice component in our clinical work. And that's why I wanted to bring this about. I mentioned this earlier. You know, I used to teach ethics when I was teaching, and there's all kinds of algorithms of how you resolve an ethical dilemma, competing values and all this, and this whole procedure. And you can find it in the social work literature. You can find it online. Just type in ethical problem solving. If I had all day, if we were doing a whole semester, I'd go into it. But I just really want you to remember 3 words. When you've got an ethical dilemma, I would suggest that you try to articulate to yourself, what are my personal values? What are my employer's values? What are society's values? How do they intersect, or how do they compete? And then, what are my duties here? And sometimes your duty is going to be to your organization. Most of the time, I hope it will be, or to your own sense of ethics. But what are my duties? And the third one is, what is everybody's interests? You know, sometimes our interests will conflict with our values. You know, an interest can be something as simple as, I don't want to get fired. I don't want to lose my license. Things like that, that might make you rethink the values and the duties that you have. We could spend the rest of the day just talking about these 3 things, but I don't want to do that. I just wanted to point it out. Real quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think you all know this. These are some of the contexts for moral activism. Discrimination, we see this written large these days with Black Lives Matter movement. Immigration reform, LGBTQ, welfare reform, mental health. The one that I'm particularly focused on these days is corrections reform. Realize we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Something horribly wrong there. And most of my work these days is with a local restorative justice program. In fact, I think next month I'm doing a program just like this on restorative justice. So if you're interested, come on back next month. Reproductive concerns, addictions treatment. I'm really interested to see a shift going on, at least here in Vermont, with how the police respond to addictions. More and more recognition that it's a mental health problem, not necessarily a criminal justice problem. So we're hoping anyway. In schools of social work, all kinds of possibilities for social justice, challenging the curriculum. In agencies, in private practice, advocating for clients, relationships with other professionals. I want to look at just tell you briefly about the middle one in agencies and clinics. Years ago, NASW had the possibility of doing a professional action. If you were an employee for an agency and you saw some unethical activity going on, you could file a complaint with NASW against the agency. While NASW didn't have a lot of clout, they could sanction the agency, they could encourage schools of social work not to send interns there. They don't do that anymore, but it was a model for practicing social justice advocacy within an agency. I would like to see it come back, but that's for another discussion.
Jacob,
yes.
I just wanted to read one of the posts in the chat from Leah. That it's also important to note that the history of social work has facets of white saviorism and how that seeps into the way we do social work.
That is a very good point. I completely agree with that. Cultural and racial issues have played into it in major ways. When I was researching it years ago, charity organization societies were just remarkably culturally insensitive. When I was a public assistance caseworker many years ago, the racial insensitivity, the condescension I saw was a very real thing. You're absolutely correct, and that's something I'm hoping we can change here. Does that answer the question? I don't know, maybe does anybody else have anything they want to add about that? Lynn, anybody typing anything in?
Not that I'm seeing.
Okay, that's an excellent point. We have been, in that sense, largely culturally insensitive. Okay, the landscape of moral action. I think you might have gotten a handout about that, I'm not sure. But, we can do things within the system. We can be more confrontational. We can practice civil disobedience. So we can take actions in extreme circumstances. One of my models for that last one, extreme circumstances, is a story that I read years ago. Some of you may have heard of a French village, Le Chambon, in southern France, a Protestant village in Catholic France. During the Nazi occupation, this village quietly and at great risk to themselves harbored hundreds and hundreds of Jews, just brought them into their homes. It was beyond civil disobedience. It was active law breaking. They were risking their own lives. So we do encounter extreme circumstances from time to time, and it's certainly not something we hope we have to do, but it is a type of moral action. Oh, why is that picture coming up funny like that? There. I want to show you some criminals. A couple of pictures of criminals. Anybody know who that is? Anybody typing anything or unmuting?
Is it Jane Addams?
Nope. Very good guess, and she's really a so.
The guess of Margaret Sanger?
That's it. This was Margaret Sanger. She actually had to flee the country to avoid being jailed. She opened up the first birth control clinic in downtown Manhattan. The story, which may be apocryphal, is that she was a public health nurse and she was visiting a woman who had just given birth in her home, in the woman's home. And the woman, and she had too many kids and they had no money. And the woman asked the doctor, "How can I stop having kids?" And the answer was, "Tell your husband to sleep on the roof." And Margaret Sanger was incensed by that answer. And she set up the first birth control clinic in New York, absolutely against the law. There were laws, the Comstock laws at the time. Today, we view her as a hero. Now, she was not a perfect person. She had some thoughts and sensibilities that distressed me, but she was a person of her time, and she took that risk to do what she felt was mandated. That was an extreme action. And I'm showing you some extreme people. Anybody recognize that guy? This one, I often get some pushback on this one. People often disagree with me about this one, whether he was a hero or a monster.
Kevorkian.
Jack Kevorkian, yes. He had a strong moral leading. I'm not asking you to unite with that. I'm simply pointing out that he was a guy who had a strong leading toward a type of social justice. Anybody on those two?
I'm guessing one is Claudette Colvin.
Do you know who she was?
No, the slide doesn't say that part.
And Rosa Parks.
That's Rosa Parks in the lower right. Upper left is Claudette Colvin, who was actually 9 months before Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin did the same thing. But the NAACP decided not to use her as an example because she was a pregnant 15-year-old. And they didn't think she would be a good test case. Rosa Parks did it very deliberately, and it was a planned move. Well, you know the history from there. And this one, I'm pretty sure you'll know.
Martin Luther King.
Yes, yeah. Forgive me if this sounds preachy and sermony, but if you haven't read his letter from Birmingham jail, I strongly encourage you to do so. It is, to me, one of the most important documents in American history. If I had my way, it would be enshrined right next to the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. He talks about civil disobedience in a way that is so beautiful and so powerful. The first time I read this, it just changed my thinking. I'm not going to read the whole thing because you're all able to read. But he talks about different types of laws. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. Then it goes on to talk about the essence of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is different from simply ignoring the law. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. Never, never be afraid to do what's right, especially if the well-being of a person or animal is at stake. And he goes on. To me, that's the most beautiful and elegant statement about civil disobedience that I've ever encountered. I've read what Gandhi had to say about it, but to me, this is the heart of it all. I hope none of us have to actually practice civil disobedience and pay the price for it, but sometimes it's essential. So, anybody have any questions about any of this before we move on? I'm trying to get out of this thing now. Lynn, help me.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to there.
Ah, good. Thank you. Okay. Oh, the technology. Do you have a handout, The Landscape of Moral Action, Resistance? I'm seeing nodding, yeah. Let me move the light a little bit here. This is really, the purpose of this document is really just to give you an opportunity to think about the situations where you encounter things, issues that might trouble you. One of my purposes in doing programs like this is to expand our thinking about social justice issues beyond the state houses and Congress and writing to legislators. We can advocate for social justice in a lot of different ways, and that's the purpose of this handout. Every chapter of NASW has an advocacy component. Vermont has been very active in that. Like my student did, pushing hard for social change within an agency. Years ago, I was with an alcoholism program, a drug and alcohol program, and there were some policies there that seriously violated confidentiality guidelines, having employers get more information than they had any right to get about their alcoholic or drug addicted employee. And I was able to talk to the people the board and the others about making those changes. And it worked. It was actually a very peaceful situation. It was an interesting struggle. The struggle is between between social workers and addictions counselors, not social workers, but addictions counselors, who had a different perspective on confidentiality. And they were a little freer about sharing information than I thought was appropriate. And but they were okay about it. It wasn't an ugly fight, but it worked. Joining advisory boards can be a very powerful tool. I'm not going to read the whole list because there's so many here. Back in the 60s, I don't know, most of you probably don't remember the 60s. Back in the 60s, the welfare rights movement was a very active thing. My first job in human services was as a public assistance caseworker in Philadelphia. And at the same time that I was there, the Welfare Rights Organization was an immensely powerful organization, kind of shaking up the welfare system. There was a famous book written called Regulating the Poor by two Columbia University professors about welfare rights, and it was the birth of the Welfare Rights Organization. What was really interesting about it is that a lot of social workers, both those who had graduate degrees and those of us who didn't, this was before I went to graduate school, were active with it, or at least supporting it. And it had a huge impact on the social welfare system. Legislators, contacting legislators, writing letters. These are some of the traditional actions. As I said before, I'm very much involved with the criminal justice system. And I've written to our state legislators. And here in Vermont, the legislators are remarkably responsive to input. We're a little state with a history of lots of participation. Something that I would also recommend is if you see some sorts of social injustice in your agencies, it's really useful to get some documentation and then go to the powers that be, the board or the governing agency, and say, here's what I've seen. Look at these. I'll give you a quick example. Waiting time. How long people have to wait in a public welfare waiting room or clinic waiting room. That can be demeaning and horrible. When I was a public assistance caseworker, it was routine for people to sit in the waiting room 4, 5, 6 hours waiting for their caseworker to come back from lunch or come back for a coffee break. It would have, I didn't do it. I was young and not quite as focused as I am now. But it would have been really interesting to do some documentation about the waiting times there. That to me is a social justice issue, treating people like that, demeaning them like that. So there are opportunities within an agency to do bits of research, to figure out what is, what's happening. I got into a battle a number of years ago with a nursing home. I wasn't there as a professional. It was a nursing home within my religious group. And they were doing some really barbaric things in terms of throwing people out, things that are now illegal. And I protested it. And the way I protested it was go to the religious group, the board that oversaw it. I failed completely. I didn't make any change at all. But what I saw was people being pushed out, discharged, what I thought was a very cruel way. My decision was to rattle the cage of the decision makers, not the executive, not the administrator, but the committee that oversaw it. Didn't work, but I still feel that my action was rightly ordered and appropriate. And we can move to some more assertive actions. Picketing, strike, or work stoppage, whistleblowing, use of the media. And we are seeing today how the media is being used and abused. I talked a little bit a few minutes ago about the welfare rights movement. What they did was overload the welfare system. What the Welfare Rights Organization did was encourage everybody who might possibly be eligible for any service to apply and overload the system. And then we can move to more aggressive actions too. The Underground Railroad. Back in the 60s, before Roe versus Wade, when abortion was still illegal, a number of liberal clergy got together and they organized what was called the Clergy Consultation Service on Problem Pregnancy. And what they did was clearly violating the law. They connected pregnant women who wanted to get an abortion with doctors who were willing to do it. Their concern was that the illegal backroom abortions were so dangerous and so horrible that they needed to do something about it. And their perception was that reproductive rights belonged to the woman. So they set up the Clergy Consultation Service. It was a quiet organization, but it did a lot of important work. I talked about that village in southern France that just protected 5,000 Jews during the Holocaust, quietly, without making a big fuss. And we see something going on today in many of our cities, sanctuary cities. Montpelier, I'm very proud of the fact that Montpelier is a sanctuary city. When the idea came along, I contacted the city council, and I said, I really encourage you to be Montpelier to become a sanctuary city. And I got a message back saying, don't worry, we're on it. It's going to happen. But it felt good to do that. Conscientious objection, draft avoidance. And one area where I think it's really important is end-of-life decisions. We looked at Jack Kevorkian, and I have some problems with the way he handled things. But there are some serious issues of social justice there, or people's individual autonomy, their right to make decisions about their lives. And how we respond to that, how we advocate for their rights is a very important issue, I think. So, anybody have any questions about any of this? I want to stop for a few minutes and see if anybody has any questions. With 54 people, no questions at all? Any comments?
Is
that Rebecca speaking? I see her hand. I don't know. I'm not sure who's speaking.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Lynn, yes.
Another example would be the American Indian movement and occupation of as well as the Trail Treaties protests.
Lynn, you're breaking up.
Rachel, can you take yourself off of mute and
Yes, so
Thank
this
you.
is Rachel Wassell
Yeah, I
from
see you.
Vermont. Hello. So I just typed in the chat. Another example of resistance in the United States would be the American Indian movement and the occupation of Alcatraz in the late 60s, early 70s, and then the subsequent protests, the Trail of Broken Treaties, and a lot of Native resistance here in the United States to colonialism and the legacy of that and white supremacy here.
Okay. Thank you. These are important things. And what we can do as individuals, as social workers, is a matter of our own conscience and our own discernment. And that's, a lot of this program is really a motivational idea, just to help people, encourage people to think about this, to think about what the opportunities are, and to see the social justice issues in spots where we might not really be seeing it. Let me give you an example from my own life. Years ago, I was working with a Polish community, a lot of older Polish folks. I don't speak a syllable of Polish. There were no other resources for these people. There was a mental health clinic in the area, a community mental health center, that didn't have a single Polish-speaking person on staff. And these people needed, as any group does, certain people needed some assistance, some help. And my sense of powerlessness to help these folks was immense. The linguistic and cultural difficulties were overwhelming. And I talked to the director of the clinic. I was just a lowly caseworker. I mean, I didn't have a whole lot of clout. But I said, it's almost impossible for us to help these people unless we can find out what they're saying. And occasionally they would bring a child or a grandchild to do some translation, but that's very imperfect. Those of you who have used interpreters know that a family translator is often very problematic. It was a clinical example of social injustice. Here was a public program purporting to provide mental health services to this population. And it was set up in a way that made it absolutely impossible. I remember one day, a lady came in, elderly lady, who had only been in the United States maybe 10 years. She lived in a Polish community, didn't speak any English at all. And the doctor who examined her was also new to America. He was from India or Pakistan. And he had heavily accented English and not very good English. And this poor woman didn't have a word of English. And she was ushered back into his treatment room and came back out a little while later. And to this day, I've wondered what could possibly have gone on in that room. I think she was underserved. She was horribly underserved. And that's an example. If I were going back to that agency today, I would be advocating fiercely for translators and interpreters. And I think there's been good movement in that direction anyway. But this was many years ago. And I still remember thinking, this is not fair. This is not right. We're supposed to be helping these people, and it's impossible. If I were back there today, I'd be advocating hard for that. That's the sort of thing I see in clinical level social injustice. Another example is, when somebody goes to a private practitioner, they're there, usually they can afford the practitioner's fee. And I'm not concerned about, practitioners deserve to charge a good fee. But when a person really can't afford it, needs to go to a public center, they often are put on long waiting lists. They're often seen by interns without proper supervision. The financial aspects of that are a social justice travesty, I think. The quality of services can be problematic. The point I'm trying to make is that at every level, we have opportunities to be aware of and look at social injustice. Anybody else have any examples? Any other questions or topics? Anybody ever encounter something? Bobby.
Well, I think this is all really great. I just wrote in the chat, a reminder recently of the pink hats and the kitty march that we did in Montpelier, and following the election and taking a stand. I think every day as mental health workers trying to stand up for our clients in the whole community mental health movement in Vermont, which really was embraced so rapidly they weren't even ready. This is in the 1970s when I first started working in Vermont, and the idea of bringing people to their community and being able to be at home and removing and starting to look at the issue of stigma. We have a parity law in Vermont, mental health parity. These are all examples of how people take a stand. I'm very moved by this. I didn't get my social work degree till I was 58. But I'd been a practicing school counselor up till that point. But it was social work and the social policy education I got at UVM, stand on social justice and critical social constructivism, that really got me aware of this, because I wanted to be a therapist, and that's what I became. But learning to balance that charge to take a stand on social injustice, and didn't realize that was my whole life was leading up to that. It's very, very exciting and reinforcing to hear this, but you and I are probably the same patients. So.
Let me give you another example of some activism on part of social work.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s, I guess, back in Philadelphia, a movement arose. There was a long-term state hospital, Pennhurst. Maybe some of you have heard of Pennhurst. It was a notorious, horrendous, just a nightmare of a place. And a coalition of social workers and lawyers, or several coalitions, were very distressed about it. And there was a lawsuit about the care given to a couple of people there. And the lawsuit was asking that these people be given better care at this horrendous snake pit of a facility. That lawsuit was a pivot in the deinstitutionalization movement that became a nationwide movement. There was a judge in Philadelphia, Judge Broderick, who got his teeth into this like a bulldog. Mm-hmm. And he led to the whole the closing down of Pennhurst. And the deinstitutionalization movement really grew from that. And it was social workers and some public interest lawyers who did that. It was people who were absolutely horrified by what they saw at Pennhurst. And the result of it was, as I say, the deinstitutionalization movement. In my community in Pennsylvania, before we moved to Vermont, these small group homes sprung up. And the people who had been institutionalized for years moved into these group homes. And I got to know a lot of these folks, did some volunteer work with them. And the quality of their lives improved so much. They became part of the community. And several of them would like to walk through town. They got to know everybody. The shopkeepers knew them. And I've often thought back to that, to the improvement in their quality of life brought about by social workers and lawyers there who saw what was going on at Pennhurst and were absolutely horrified. Linda.
I'm so glad you mentioned the interpreter issues. It is still not very good in Vermont. No. It's a lot of private practice especially having a hard time hiring qualified interpreter because of the cost, and the government has not really standardize or make any rules on helping, individual business. And also for the agency, there's just not a lot of help to help interpreter being qualified. In Vermont is so, and I work at the Community Health Center of Burlington, and it sounds like there, all these beautiful statements, all this, commitment. It's actually, there's a mess in there. And I feel so good now that my calling people out, my pushing back, I'm not a troublemaker, I'm just being resistant.
Linda, can I ask a question of you, and maybe others will want to chime in on an answer? What more might there be for you or others to do in that situation? And I'm asking you, and I'm asking everybody, suggestions for Linda?
In terms of
making sure that agencies have good translation, certain qualified translators.
Well,
I don't want to put you on the spot. You've done a lot, but
I could go on and on. I think number one is to help big agency like the hospital and community health center or Howard Center, who use a lot of interpreter, could have come together and make sure that there's standard for interpreters. On the other hand of it, to push the government to have a licensure or certification process for interpreter, and be able to, I was interpreter for a long time and I left to social work because I was nowhere. I paid the same for 5 years. There's job and not very secure, just not very good for good people. And I know a lot of good interpreter left because there's nothing, career path. And education with provider, how to work with interpreter. There's no, I'm going to do some shameless, advertisement here. I do the training. I think I'm going to do another one in January, right, Lynn said. I'm on the board of NASW. So there's not a lot of training for providers either. And it just, we have a lot to do.
So you've got you really sunk your teeth into an issue here. It's an important issue you've identified. Can I offer a suggestion?
Yes, please.
Whatever social advocacy efforts you're doing there, whatever advocacy efforts you're putting forth, will be far more powerful if you're part of a coalition. That is, bring in allies.
Yep.
When you're a single voice, very often I've certainly experienced this. When you're a single voice, you're often dismissed as an agitator or a nutcase. I've been called both, and maybe they were right. I don't know. Probably accurate assessments at the time. But when there's a group of people, it's a whole lot more difficult for the people who can affect change to do that change. It's the essence of what labor unions are about. One person screaming for higher wages won't get anywhere, but a group of people will. I wish you the best in that. Does anybody else have any thoughts for Linda? Lynn, you just came on live here.
Yep, because I just want to be the timekeeper because we are going to give people a break, and it's right now almost 10 minutes of 10.
That's exactly where I was about to go. So I just have to take a second here and say I am so grateful for Lynn's handling all of this. It's been so good to work with here. So, well,
would it be a good time to take, like, if we did 12 minutes and came back at 10 o'clock?
Yeah, let's see if anybody has any questions or comments before we break.
If anybody wants to take themselves off of mute, I know there are a couple things in the chat. Reb, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much. I so appreciate this workshop because I am one that feels that social workers are, just key in us moving forward as a society to bring back some just and equitable treatment of those who are oppressed. So I just want to thank you, Lynn and Jacob, for standing up and really, you know, pointing out the importance of the influence that we have, not only as individuals, but as a group. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that.
I was going
Somebody?
to add that I think one of the areas of resistance that I don't think we think of is once we become supervisors in social work, what are the ways that we are encouraging young and new professional social workers to look at this lens of social work? I find often when I'm having a conversation with somebody I supervise and really speak to, you know, the reasons why maybe I chose social work over counseling, you know, what are the unique nature of the social justice, primarily for me, and civil disobedience, that are really important for us as supervisors, for those of us that supervise, to highlight. I think sometimes we can get so sucked into whatever clinical work or agency work that we're doing that we forget to bring that into the supervision. And I find that, you know, we got to grow the profession. We need to make sure that that continues. And also there's social justice issues in terms of lack of representation within our profession. And when we supervise and encourage people who often maybe haven't historically joined this field, and help them feel like this is a place to be resistant, this is a place to be a strong voice, I think it really shapes the direction the profession's going, and in that way, better shifts change in our communities as well.
Appreciate that. At the very end of our program, we're going to talk about moral disengagement. And I'll tell you a story about how one of my students, who later went on to very, very high level work, uses what she learned from me in school about moral disengagement. We'll cover that, I promise, before we break today. You got a very young baby there with you. How old?
Just 6 weeks.
Oh, wow. Boy or
Congratulations.
girl?
Thank you.
Boy or girl?
A little girl.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Before we break, one thing. I showed you those pictures from the slideshow about those horrible pictures from New York, taken by Jacob Riis. There was a book that came out maybe 15 years ago called 5 Points. It's about this notorious part of New York City in the 19th century. I learned more about the conditions that led to these reform movements from this book than from any social work text. It is one of the best history books I've ever read. If any of you saw the movie Gangs of New York, anybody see that? Anybody remember that movie? With Daniel Day-Lewis, who is a great actor. It was based on this book. If you want to learn more about the conditions that led to those reform movements, I really recommend this book. It's been out for a number of years. If you go to Amazon, you can get a used copy for a few bucks, and it's fascinating reading. I've read it 3 times. And I wasn't aware of it when I was teaching, but if I were teaching today, no student would get out of my class without reading at least some of it. So it's a wonderful book by a guy named Tyler Anbinder. And just a fascinating book. I don't normally recommend books in these programs, but this one's exceptional. So, okay, shall we take a break and come back in, let's see, it's 9:53 now. So come back, say 5 after 10.
Sounds good.
Don't.
We'll see you all at 10:05.
Don't leave the meeting. Just mute yourself and stop the video if you like.
Turn off your camera if you like. Hey, Jacob, are you
Oh,
there?
yeah.
Do you want to do the breakout soon after the break start?
Yeah, give me a couple of minutes to talk. I got one or two things really briefly to talk about, and then we'll do the case study.
Okay.
Then we'll get back and just get any commentary people had on the cases. I'm not asking them to answer. This is what I would do. It's almost impossible. But we'll bring them back after the case studies. And then I want to talk about moral disengagement, and then I think we got it.
Okay, so how long in the breakout rooms?
Let's see, we're going to 11, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. If we get them into the break room at 10 after 10, 10:15 to be realistic.
Okay.
And we bring them back at 10:30 or 10:40.
10, so you want 25 minutes.
Yeah. Make it 20 minutes.
Okay.
Like I said, I do these things organically. Let's make it 20 minutes. 10:15, 10:35. And then we'll process it. I'll talk moral disengagement and any questions. The bottom one is by John Rawls. Now, he is the most famous philosopher that nobody's ever heard of. He wrote a massive book called A Theory of Justice. Very difficult read. I couldn't finish the whole thing. You know, it was just overwhelming. But his ideas about justice and fairness are very important. Many of the social programs of the 60s and 70s, the good ones, were based on John Rawls' philosophy. He was a philosophy professor at Harvard. If that sort of topic interests you, I would urge you to just look through A Theory of Justice by Rawls. He talks a little bit about civil disobedience. By its nature, an act responding to injustices internal to a given society. And he reminded us that our country,
one second. And then I squeal and then
somebody needed to mute, I think it's okay now. John Rawls reminded us that our country was born in civil disobedience, and civil disobedience is a fundamental action of our democracy. Generally, civil disobedience is best done in groups, but it depends on the situation. But there's a dark side too that I need to confess about. There have been a couple of occasions where I just plain broke the law. I tell you about it now because the statute of limitations is long, long, long over. But you would be justified in telling me you think I was out of line. When I've presented this to people, some people said, right on, Jacob, you did exactly the right thing. Others said, you really blasted me for being really out of line. The situation, I'm not going to give you the details because I want to continue to protect myself. A case where I was clearly a mandated reporter. I was supposed to report suspected child neglect and abuse to the authorities. It was a situation that I was deeply involved in as a professional. And it became very clear to me that the danger of neglect or abuse was over. It was absolutely over. The perpetrator was in prison and was not coming out for a long, long time. The remaining people were safe. And yet, you know, I sought some consultation from colleagues and they said, Jacob, the law is clear. You have to report this. You have no choice. I thought long and hard about it. I really lost sleep over it for a day or two. And I decided not to report it because I could see no good coming out of that report. I could see only disruption and confusion. And I made a decision to just forego doing the report. I clearly violated the law. There was no question about it. I stayed in touch with the case, just following up. I wasn't continuing to provide service because there really wasn't any needed. But I stayed in touch because I was very nervous about this whole situation. I stayed in touch for a couple of years, and the situation played out exactly as I hoped it would play out. That everything went fine within the context. I think I did the right thing, but I broke the law. No question about it. So as I said, I have been applauded for that. I've been blasted for that. And, you know, I have some regrets about breaking the law, but in the final analysis, I think that the result was worthwhile. In another case, it's actually something like this in one of the case studies. Back when I was a public assistance caseworker, you know, one of the absolute rules was never, 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 never give clients money. Don't take money out of your own pocket and give it to them. Well, I just broke that rule one day because I saw a situation where somebody was desperate. And it's one of the case studies. Whichever groups get that case study, you'll be able to chew on it too. And it was a matter of this woman losing her kids because of having the kids in an unheated house, or me taking money out of my wallet and giving it to her so she could buy enough oil or coal, I forget, to get through the next few days till she got her next check. And I gave her the money. I probably would have been fired for it if my supervisor ever found out about it. I tell you this because I simply want to be complete about the spectrum of options. I'm not recommending you break the law, but I wanted to talk about some of my own discernments in those two cases where I decided to just do what I thought was rightly ordered. More recently, my wife and I are both volunteers with Montpelier Community Justice Center, and we do COSA programs, Circles of Support and Accountability for people coming out of prison. And we're not supposed to give them money, but once or twice, these guys have literally had no food. I mean, no food in their house, and they were going to go hungry until they could conjure up some food. So I took them shopping. I've done this twice. I took them shopping. I felt somehow that was a little different from just handing them cash. I took them to the supermarket. And, you know, I wasn't there in a professional status. And I told the director of the program, I said, you know, sometimes just human need overpowers any guidelines. And he was okay with it, but it was a violation of the guidelines. So, you know, what I'm talking about is the interplay between regulations and conscience. I am not advocating that you do what I did. I'm just setting myself up as an example, either good or bad. So we're going to get to the case studies now. We're going to get some breakout time. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions or comments or anything they want to, or if anybody wants to blast me for breaking the law? I'm used to that. So any thoughts, any comments? Any questions?
There is a lot of, you know, first of all, I'm so glad you share your story, and it definitely had helped me to justify my action, some of my actions. But there's a lot of, you know, the supervisor will tell you, oh, what if the person rely on it? What if he keep coming and ask for it? Like all those, oh, therapeutic relationship, you know, like maybe the family just keep coming for therapy or getting your service because this kind of action. How do you address those whatever? Those good old arguments, you know?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the last think you said.
Oh, those good old arguments of, ethics, the what if,
You present ethical arguments as you can, doesn't mean everybody's going to accept them. We're talking about a matter of personal conscience here and personal values. In the world of ethics, in academic ethics, there are three different types. There's more than that, but three major types of ethics. There's utilitarian ethics, what's the best good for the best number of people. Moral ethics, what are the moral laws that guide this? And the third type of ethics, which used to be called feminist ethics, it's called virtue ethics, where the question is, what does my action say about me? What is this? How does it reflect on me? I have a policy and practice of always giving money to homeless people when I see them, when I can, because I don't want to be the kind of person who can walk past a person in distress. And I think that's the question, that's the dilemma you're putting forth, if I understand you correctly, Linda. What do you do? What does it say about you? And are you prepared to hear negative responses from other people? And are you prepared to take the consequences if it's an act of civil disobedience or breaking the law? I recognized during that child welfare thing, I might have lost my license. And in a reckless moment, I said, what the heck, if that happens, it happens. It didn't. I'm not sure I responded fully to you, Linda. Is there more that did I answer properly?
I guess I'm more like on the other side of, conflict of interest in terms of, I think I'm trying to, make myself make sense. That, say for example, if, that person is your counseling person, your therapy person, and that person keep coming to therapist, hoping that you would, continue to provide, cash or bring them shopping or, it may not happen, but that was, that I have heard previous supervisor argue with that as that's why you shouldn't do it. It is will complicate therapeutic relationship.
That's true. That's absolutely correct. It will complicate the relationship. In that situation where I gave money to the person, yeah, that was a dual relationship, no question about it. But at that moment, in the moment there, my thought was, we got a bunch of people who are going to be cold, and maybe this is going to disrupt the family. A decision at that moment ignored the ongoing after effects. You're right. I can't argue that. That was an ethical discernment I made at a dead run. And reflecting on what you've just said, yeah, there were perhaps negative consequences to it. But it wasn't a counseling relationship. It was a financial relationship. It was a public assistance relationship. Any other thoughts or questions before we
Yeah.
move on?
I'd just like to build on what Linda was saying, that while those questions I think are kind of rote, and I've definitely been asked those questions, what's the sustainability of this? Is it, the different ethical implications? I think it's important to ask those questions and to seek guidance, because we only see through our lens, and having the outside perspective from whoever you trust is important to widen that lens of expectation. Because, I've had a case where I was working with a teenager and they had a therapeutic relationship, and that person bought them a mattress because they didn't have one. And then when he went to him a couple months later for the next financial thing and that person couldn't deliver on it, the teenager said, well, F you, I'm not working with you anymore. You didn't follow through. You clearly don't care about me. So, and that person hadn't sought consultation on whether or not they should purchase a mattress or how to go about that. And it was a clear example where maybe some follow through or just, you know, problem solving around it could have it kept that therapeutic relationship intact. And I don't blame that person for thinking, well, I have a mattress, I'm just going to do it, because that is the human response. So there is always that balance of human, professional. What does professional mean in a helping profession? And I think wrestling with those things is really part of the ethical response.
Rachel, thank you so much for sharing that. I agree with every word you said. And I want to emphasize, I want to just hold up one thing that Rachel said. Get consultation.
Yeah.
Don't make these, except if you're in an urgent situation like I was with this cold family. Consultation is so important. If you remember your ethics classes from when you were in school, one of the points that the teacher made or should have made is when you're in an ethical mess, get consultation. Don't ever make that decision alone if you have the luxury of doing that. Sometimes these situations come along at a dead run. You know, there's an interesting new challenge with ethics with self-driving cars. They're trying to figure out how to build an ethical algorithm into the computers. If a self-driving car is heading for an accident, who do they run into? The older person or the younger person? And they're coming up with no answers really on how to build in ethics to a self-driving car. Ethical challenges are everywhere in our lives. Any other thoughts before we move to the case studies?
I was working at a child and family services agency a few years ago, and my assignments were mainly children. One day, a mother came to me, and she was distraught. She had been raped, and she needed counseling. And the wait list for counseling adults at that agency was at least 6 months. So I knew that if I had asked my supervisor, can I counsel the mother, she would say, no, you need to refer her to the adult section of the agency. And so I didn't ask my supervisor, and I charged it under the child therapy, but I spoke with the mother for a few sessions. Mm-hmm. And I felt like by helping the mother, I was helping the child. So I didn't feel guilty about that, but I knew I had broken the rules of the agency.
Mm-hmm. We do, that's one of those ethical discernment issues. Now, you might have taken some heat for that.
I would have if I had mentioned it to anyone, but the mother was extremely grateful. She was able to get back on her feet, regain her self-esteem to some degree, put things in perspective, and move on.
Those are the ethical dilemmas. Those are the outcomes we hope for. We don't always get them, but I appreciate you sharing that. I think we should move on to the case studies. There are 6 case studies, and thank goodness Lynn is going to handle the breakout groups. Lynn, I think we need to revise our timing. It's 10:22 already. Let's have people come back at 10:40. How's that? Okay?
Okay. Hold on.
Let me just tell you what I'm hoping for. This is sort of a what would you do thing with each of these 6 case studies. And when you come back, we'd like to hear, what your thoughts were about it, but not necessarily do you have to say, this is what I would do. But look at what do you see the challenges are? What are the tensions there? What direction might you go in? I'm just interested in any feedback about it. The purpose of this really is not for you to make a decision, and this is what I'll do, but just to hold up some of the dilemmas that we encounter, just to raise consciousness about the dilemmas that we encounter in both clinical and larger work. So, okay, let me turn it over to Lynn.
I'm going to break you into your breakout rooms. There are 6 case studies. So take note when you go into your breakout room, what breakout room you're in. So 1 and 7 will have case study 1, 2 and 8 will have case study 2, and so on. Does that make sense? All right, here you go.
10:40, we'll be back. Lynn, can I go into case study rooms?
You're going to go into a case study room, and if you want to get pulled back, you can either stay in the waiting room or you can go into a room and then come back to the waiting room and I can pop you into the others.
I'm going to let them just do it. Well, let me join this. I'm in breakout room 11. I'll go sit, just lurk for a bit.
Okay. Caitlin and Azra, are you needing to be, you need to join your breakout rooms. There we go. Caitlin? There we go.
Okay. The purpose of giving you those case studies was really just to kind of poke at you a little bit and stimulate your thinking. In each of those, the answer is situational. I can't tell you this is what you would do in each of these cases. It has to do with your personal discernment. But I'm interested in any feedback you might have, any thoughts that came out of this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we have one more topic I really want to cover. But any feedback, any thoughts? Bobby, did you see your hand up? You need to unmute.
Okay. Well, yeah, it was a great discussion. I mean, we sort of identified a lot of, things that came to mind. I mean, the last we ended up sort of talking about being risky if you go it alone.
Mm-hmm.
And then it brought up that issue of going alone and needing this is a community issue. Ours was a case of a toilet and a school district making a ruling about transgender students and which bathroom they need to use based on their gender at birth. So, but it was, so many different issues in terms of, depending on the community, depending on the region of the country you're in, easier or difficult it would be to have, a conversation about this, looking at the laws and what does the law say. So those were just some of the ideas. Oh, and how this extends to other areas like sports. What do you do around sports? So really looking at the broad issues and then knowing the context that you're in and trying to figure out what resources you have available.
Mm-hmm.
We had that same scenario in our small group, and we talked a lot about advocating and really working with the parents and the school board and stuff and really coming down to whose issue is it, because oftentimes these issues really are like the parents' issues and the teachers' issues. The kids don't really care what bathroom anybody's using. So really kind of getting to who's it bothering and how can we solve it from that angle as well.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? One way to look at these studies, these case studies, is to look at that from the perspective of values, duties, and interests. What values are in play there? And really importantly, what are your interests in it? The most common interest that people have is, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my license. There may be other interests. But if you ask yourself, what are my values here and what duties do my values or the agencies or the profession's values suggest I have? How do my values lead to my duties? And then how are my personal interests mitigating what those duties might be? It's one way to look at them. It's very often we ignore our personal interests in discussion. We treat them as important because we want to keep our jobs. But looking at any advocacy issue, any ethical issue.
Well, sometimes oops, sorry.
Go ahead. I don't know who was.
I'm just saying, sometimes you may not want to keep that job. Sometimes
that's quite true.
If the conflicts are too big.
And then you have an interest in getting out of the job, which is fine. I know somebody one day, she had been a student of mine, and she called me up, and she was working at an agency, and her boss was just so corrupt and doing so many awful things. And she was not in a position to fight it in any way. What she did was get up out of this supervision meeting and go to her desk and get her personal stuff and walk out of the office and never went back. I wouldn't have advised her to do that, but she just felt she couldn't be there anymore. Yeah, it's a good point you make. Sometimes, you know, your interest is in not necessarily keeping a job, but just knowing, you know, what is your interest? About a dozen years ago, my wife and I were directors of a conference center where we put on regular programs out in California, there for about 5 years. And we sometimes would lock horns with the board of directors, not in a really nasty way, but we had difficulties. And I had no worries about losing my job because they couldn't replace us. I mean, we were an essential operating team there. So it gave me the ability and the power to speak up very directly and very bluntly, because my interest in keeping my job was not in play there. And I got into some battles with the board. And what's interesting is I invariably won the battles, or my wife won the battles, you know, about a number of things. So looking at those three things, interests, values, and duties, our values and our agency's values and the profession's values will lead to some discernment of what our duties are. Then we put in the intervening variable of our interests, and it'll help you figure out what to do. And then you look at, you know, what coalitions can I build here if I need to do that? Okay, how's our time here? What is it? It's 10:49, my goodness, we're out of here at 11. I have one more thing I'd like to talk about. Are there other questions before we go on?
I was just going to say that one of my social work professors told us that a good social worker will be fired from at least 2 jobs in their lifetime.
That's really interesting. I like that. Didn't happen to me, but I could see that. That makes a lot of sense. I have one more thing I would like to talk about. And this is something I talk about at virtually every program. I'll force fit it into a program, no matter what the program topic is. You have a handout called The Tools of Moral Disengagement. Albert Bandura is a psychologist, and I believe he's still alive. He'd be about 96 or 97 now at Stanford University. And he did the original work on social learning, but he also got interested in this topic of moral disengagement, about how we justify bad actions or bad mindsets, morally disengaging from them. And when I first encountered it, I was very taken by it, and I've made a point of trying to teach it whenever I can. I used to use this when I was teaching at Marywood, and one of my students was very taken by it. This is years ago. And she got a job after graduating, a job at a large clinic, and she's moved up several levels now. She's an administrator now. And she called me up a number of years after she had graduated, and we had stayed in touch vaguely. And she told me that she's still using this handout. And what she would do is, with her subordinates, she would have roundtable discussions about it, asking them to think about whether any of this applied to them. We all have done moral disengagement, justifying actions that might not be ideal. And I've always liked to present this. And what I ask of you is, think about it. None of this may apply to you, but I would bet if we're all honest with ourselves, some of us will have at one time or another done this. I know I have. I've gone through this list many times. And, you know, I'm sorry to say, I have morally disengaged on a number of times because my interests got in the way. I just want to run through this really quick. I love this quote by Pascal, by the way. People never do evil so happily as when they do it for the sake of conscience. Moral justification. This situation calls for extreme actions. The end doesn't always justify the means. Maybe it does, but you need to be thoughtful about that. And here's one that really is a problem for social workers, for all any of the professional mental health fields. Sanitizing language and euphemistic labeling. Encouraging personal responsibility by reducing welfare benefits. It's just cutting benefits, that's all that is. Enhanced interrogation methods. Anybody know what that is? Enhanced interrogation methods.
Torture.
Torture. Administrative segregation. Bobby, unmute. Administrative segregation.
I mean, obviously, you know, it just doesn't make any sense to me, but it, like somehow separating administrative duties or,
Yep.
Yeah.
Administrative segregation has a very specific meaning. I'll give you a hint. It's in the world of corrections.
Is it isolation rooms?
Solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's what they call it. By the way, this is you know, the issue where I'm active these days is in corrections. If you want to really become alert to what that's about, mark out the dimensions of a solitary confinement cell. You can find that online. Just put some masking tape on the floor and try to stay within that for a while. Solitary confinement or administrative segregation, it's torture. It's nothing but torture. And yet, if you call it administrative segregation, that just sounds like you're doing some bureaucratic process. Advantageous comparison. This isn't so bad compared to what used to be done in this situation. I've talked to people involved in the correction system. I have to say, Vermont is pretty good. Not perfect, it's got some problems, but I've been in the Vermont prisons and there are worse. I've been in Pennsylvania prisons and they're much worse. But, you know, when you say, well, it's not as bad as Mississippi or it's not as bad as Pennsylvania, what you're doing is dismissing the problems. Saying, well, okay, but Pennsylvania is worse and Parchment in Mississippi is even worse than that. It's a way of disengaging from the immediate problems that you're seeing. And of course, the most common one, displacement of responsibility. I was just following instructions. Just one of the many people in this bureaucracy. A few of you might be old enough to remember the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was a Nazi, leading Nazi involved in the death camps. And he was tried and convicted in Israel. But his argument was that he was just a bureaucrat. I was just following instructions. I didn't see the terrible things going on. It wasn't my job to look at that. I was forced into doing it. It was just, my interest was in doing it. I did some things when I worked for that drug and alcohol program that I did because that was the rules, and I regret the things I did. And disregard for the consequences. Well, boy, I'm glad I don't have to see what happens here. I'm glad I'm an office worker instead of having to go out on the wards, which is a way of paying no attention to the serious problems that are out there. And minimizing the consequences. Not so bad when they lose their food stamps. They'll manage somehow. Oh, they're getting laid off, you know, from their $40 an hour job. They'll get a job at 7-Eleven. That's not so bad. They'll manage. And I want to emphasize this last one. This is one my students and my people I supervise learned to be very careful about with me because I would just leap on them when they did this. When we dehumanize a person by confusing the person and their diagnosis. This one just makes me crazy. I become absolutely frantic when my students did it, when my supervisors did it. He's a schiz. No, he's not. He's a person suffering from schizophrenia. And there's a common one now, very common one, that both therapists and their clients use. I'm bipolar. Not I suffer from bipolar disorder, or he's a bipolar. No, it's a human being, person suffering from bipolar disorder. These are the things that we do to turn our minds away from the pain and difficulties that we see from the social justice issues. I recognize that this has a sermonizing quality to it, but it's important, I think, for us to be aware of this. The former student that I talked about would use this in discussions with the people she supervised and ask them to think about it and be aware of it and to challenge each other about it. So I think we're coming near the end of time. What time is it? Oh, 2 minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments or any thoughts? Anything you want to share?
I just want to thank you, Jacob. You're one of my favorite trainers.
Thank you so much. It's good to hear. Any other questions? Any final words of wisdom?
This is Andrea. I just wanted to mirror that response. Every time I'm with you and we have these discussions, I think is always robust and lots of information. And without fail, you always get my energy pumping and my hot flashes going. I love it.
Thank you so much. That's really good to hear. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. This has been very thoughtful. Yes. Hi, this is Janine. This has been very thought-provoking, and I wish we had more time, but thank you so very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. One more comment, if I may, and then we'll probably close out. You have a bunch of handouts. Please feel free to hand them out to others, to use them. You don't need my permission to copy them and hand them out. All I ask is you leave my name attached to them. I've had some of my stuff taken without and my name erased from it. Some of the stuff could be very useful in discussion in peer supervision groups or with the people you supervise. And I think we've done it here. I think, Lynn, we've got it right to 11.
I think we have. Thank you all for joining us. And I will repeat that you should be receiving in your email probably in the next minute, for those of you who are receiving CEUs, the evaluation form, and you are going to return it to Barbara. And Barbara's email is in my email. Don't return it to me. Barbara works Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so don't expect anything today or even Monday. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend and that we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jacob. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great class. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
All the way from Florida. Thank you.
Oh!
Working for Biden-Harris in Florida.
Oh,
go for it.
Wow.
Woo! All
right.
We got a road to go, but we're going to do it.
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.